see there that the global average growth rate of research output is 5%. And between 2011 and 2021, within this region, the compound annual growth rate was actually double that at 10%. So we're seeing a very rapid research growth compared to the global average here. Also an increase in the scholarly impact when we're measuring that, and looking at the global share as well, as you would expect with that increased growth rate. So accelerating from just 2% of global share in 2011 to 8% by last year in 2021. Okay, so we've looked at the total research output trends by the whole region. If we break that down by country, we can see some of the slight variations in growth rate between the different nations. So UAE, Saudi Arabia and Egypt having the highest growth rates there across all of the research output. Then if we look at open access publishing, which obviously at this conference is what we're all interested in, and again, looking at the proportion of that research output that was open access has grown from just 24% in 2013 up to 37% in 2021. So really increasing there with that growth rate of 15%. And again, UAE, unsurprisingly, Qatar, given all the work that's going on with open research there, and Saudi Arabia with the fastest growth rates, particularly in open access articles. Now I'm going to touch briefly on F1000. So we will come on to talk in more detail about what the F1000 publishing model is. But I just wanted to pull this out to show the dramatic increase that we've seen from this region on that particular publishing platform. So relatively low absolute numbers, but a 350% increase in terms of the published output on that platform. So I think really highlighting there the demand that we're seeing from researchers here for open research models. Again, Saudi Arabia and Egypt are the countries with the highest submissions on that platform. And we'll come on to talk about the types of submissions as well in more detail, but of those, 64% were for what we would class as a traditional research article. But actually, that translates into roughly a 50-50 split as to what's being published on the platform. So I think at this conference, we've mentioned several times that it's been referenced that, you know, we need to define what we mean by open science. We're not necessarily just talking about research articles, and I think that's really important. And we can see here the appetite already for publishing other types of outputs. So on this particular publishing platform, 48% of the outputs are a traditional article, as would be published in a more traditional journal, but actually 52% are other types of output that occur throughout the research process. So things like systematic reviews, data notes, software tools, all of these really valuable outputs that perhaps don't necessarily get the credit or the sort of elevated status in traditional publishing. So I think it's really encouraging to see that this is already happening in the region. And I think there's been quite a lot of discussion around the challenges in adopting open research practices, but actually we can see here in the data that there's already progress and there's already a kind of positive starting point that we're working from. One of the things that we've been looking at, and I'm personally really interested in, is to think about what this actually means for the research. So I think we talk a lot about, as I have just done myself, volume of research that's published open and looking at stats of numbers of articles, proportion of articles that are published open. But what's that actually meant? What's that gone on and done for those research communities and for the wider kind of impact on knowledge? So we've done some analyses of articles that have been made open through some of our transformative agreements at Taylor and Francis. And this is just a really small snapshot of that to look at just under one agreement. So you can see on the left there that if we look at this in-year citations from this particular agreement, overall we saw a 39% increase in citations, despite the number of articles remaining stable. So those in-year citations, so that it's directly comparable. I think have we gone again? No, we're okay. So that it's directly comparable, saw a 39% increase. And actually, that was even more pronounced in certain subject areas. So we know that the majority of funding historically has tended to be in STEM subjects for open access. So one of the benefits of these read and publish agreements or transformative agreements that we've seen is that it's opened up research subject areas that wouldn't necessarily have had access to APC funding or open access funding through other means. So in history, for example, we've seen a 107% increase in citations, again, despite the article numbers remaining stable. That's just looking at the citations. We can also look at alternative metrics. So using the alt metrics here, this is one particular example of an article that came out of the University of Southampton in the UK. It's one of the highest scoring alt metric articles, unsurprisingly, looking at the subject. But the thing that's interesting to note about this, it was published open access under one of these agreements. And if you look at the social media engagement, 90% of the 3,000 or so tweets that it accrued were from users who were registered as a member of the public. So not necessarily somebody who is affiliated with an institution and practicing as an academic. And yet this is in a subject area that has affected all of our lives so significantly for the past few years. So again, I think really highlighting the benefits that of all those people who read it and engaged with it, they would not necessarily otherwise have had access. So some really interesting things that we're seeing in terms of what all of this opening up of research is actually meaning for how that research is then used and reused and engaged with, which is really exciting. Okay, so I'm going to move on just to touch on the publishing models then. So as I said, we tend to focus, I think, particularly, I suspect, a traditional publisher like Taylor & Francis on the journal article. But I think it's really important that we think more broadly than that. And that's what I want us to do today and what we're going to explore a bit further. So first of all, I think if I was stood here, I was going to say 10 years ago, but I think even 5 years or 3 years ago, when we look at the publishing landscape and the venues that are available to researchers to share their work, it tends to be kind of publishers like Taylor & Francis that we think of. But actually this research landscape and this space is evolving incredibly rapidly, and the number of tools that are out there, the preprint servers, the publishing models available, the ways that we can share data, that we can measure impact, have just grown astronomically, which is very exciting. It means that there's, a far broader range of options available to researchers, which can only be a good thing for furthering science. I think one of the challenges of that, and we have heard a lot about that at this conference as well, is for researchers to then sort of make their way through this landscape and to know, okay, well, what does that mean for me, and where should I be putting my research, and where can I trust that is a legitimate and ethical venue? So we absolutely recognize that, and I think there's been a lot of discussion about what can be done to support researchers in that. But I think it's good to ground ourselves in this and to realize that this is the space that we're now operating in, and that these kind of innovative publishing models is not just, the likes of F.O.R.M, which was launched 10 years ago and at the time was fairly unique, but is now very much part of a much broader ecosystem of different ways of kind of sharing research and reusing it. So why are we talking about all this and thinking about it then? So traditionally, it's pretty much the research article that gives the author any kind of credit. That's what they're measured on, and that's what generally is shared in journals and on publishing platforms, and that's what we pay most attention to. All of us here can recognize, I think, that actually to get to that final point and to be able to submit that article, there's an enormous amount of effort and work and processes and outputs that underpin all of that, right through from the peer review, but even before that, in all of the literature that's been reviewed for it, any kind of research code or software that's been developed as a part of that research practice. And this is what we really want to kind of shine a light on with the F.O.R.M model, is to kind of not let this get lost, as it sometimes does in more traditional models. And of course, once the researcher has gone through all of that process, it's not necessarily just an article that can be an output of that. So making sure, again, that we are elevating the status of other outputs, whether it's method articles, data notes, preprints, all of those kind of other elements that are invaluable when we're thinking about reproducibility and giving credit to the entire research life cycle. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Becky, who's going to talk to you in a bit more detail about how we're actually addressing some of these challenges through the F1000 model and what that really means for researchers publishing there.
Thank you, Carolyn. And hello, everybody in the room and online. Really great to be here, and it's been such an interesting conference so far. So a pleasure to be able to contribute to that in some way. So Carolyn's given you the context there of what's happening in the region, what we see happening in the region from a publisher perspective. And we've titled this presentation quite boldly, in that we're saying kind of making open research a reality for researchers in the Middle East and North Africa. And we know, and listening to the other presentations at this conference, it's clear there's not one size fits all solution. There's not kind of one easy fix, otherwise that would have been done. And so what we're proposing here and what I'm going to talk about is not that one size fits all solution. It's just one way that researchers can embed open research practices into their publishing practices and into their research as a whole. And so this is where we come to the case study of F1000, which is the publisher that I work at in close collaboration with Taylor and Francis. So it's worth taking a step just to give some context, because we know F1000 is a relatively new publisher and it's a relatively small publisher. And so I'm going to take you through a little bit of a potted history of how we've got to where we are now. So we began our publishing journey in 2013. So as Carolyn says, we're just about to come up to our 10th anniversary. And in 2013, we launched F1000 Research, which is that very orange image platform, which was our first foray into open research publishing. And we say platform, but actually it can act quite like a journal. It has an ISSN, it's indexed like a journal, but it operates in a publishing model very differently to a traditional journal. And I'll talk about the aspects of that on the next slide. But essentially, as a new publisher, as a born open access publisher, we had the privilege of being able to think, how do we want to do something differently? How do we want to kind of enable open research? And that's where our model has come from. In the last 10 years, as Carolyn's slide a few presentation slides ago noted, a lot's changed. It's been a background of a real changing landscape in scholarly publishing, where we've seen a demand for more enabling earlier sharing of research in a more digital environment and being much more transparent. And we found since our first launch in 2013 that a number of partners have started working with us who also shared our vision when it came to open research and who had their own open access policies and their own mandates. And this helped them on their own journeys. So we've mentioned a few here, largely funders. So since 2016, we work with the Wellcome Trust, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the European Commission as well. And each of those, we've set up their own publishing platform using the principles that we launched with F1000 Research. But the partners that we work with also vary hugely. And I've got an example here of Sidra Medicine in Qatar, who we work with on F1000 Research, who have their own space and who are able to make sure that their researchers can publish in a very open research way. And then we joined the Taylor and Francis group in 2020. So I've talked a lot about our publishing model, and so it's worth just going through that and exactly how we work and what makes us different. And here are some of the key components of that. And so I'm going to give this as a broad overview and then do a bit of a deeper dive into some of the key aspects that we get asked about a lot. So firstly, it's worth saying we're very much about rapid and open publication of articles. So that's accelerating access and openness of research. And the way that we do that is we have what we call a post-publication peer review model. And so what that means is essentially we reverse the traditional publishing model of a journal, where peer review happens first behind closed doors, and then the article is published after that quality assurance. We turn that process around. So we will publish first and then we peer review. And obviously in doing that, we need to have a real set of stringent editorial checks early on in the process. So what we publish before peer review, we make sure it's sound. But then it will have that quality validation of peer review. So essentially, we're not holding authors up while the peer review process happens, and we're enabling them to share their research much earlier in their process. And there's been a lot of talk at this conference around open data and the core role that plays in open research. And that very much is part of what we do as well. So F1000 has an open data policy, and we endorse the FAIR data principles. So we will help authors share their underpinning data for their research in an open and accessible way and manage access where needed. Carolyn's talked about the range of article types that we offer for researchers. So I won't dwell too much on that, but I'll have some more information later. And the fact that our model works on the basis that we publish and then we peer review means that research can be iterated and updated and versioned in real time. So it really repositions research as a living thing that can evolve as part of the peer review process, and the reader and the reviewer can track that progress. And I've mentioned the peer review process a few times. Another key element of our model is that it's completely open. We have an open peer review process that happens after publication, and I will go into that in more detail. But taken together, this is all about dissemination of sound and reproducible research and maximizing the discoverability and potential for that research to have impact. So where Carolyn was talking about kind of what does this actually mean for research, this is all what we're trying to enable through these practices. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on 3 of the elements to give you a bit more information. So firstly, our open data policy, the range of article types that we support, and our open peer review process. So open data, I'm going to talk through what F1000's open data policy is, how we help researchers, but also why we ask researchers to share their data openly. And that's the why is where I'm going to start, because I think it's worth just taking a step back and thinking kind of why is this important? And there's been lots of talk about this, so this may not be anything new to you, but it's worth taking some time to go through. So firstly, the practice of sharing data openly, from a researcher's point of view, it boosts their credibility. It means that the claims and the results of their research, they can link to their data and other people can validate it, can see it and can reuse it. But also by sharing their data in a data repository, it really increases the visibility and discoverability of their research as well. So not only is their article available on a platform or a publishing platform or a journal, their data set is also available, has a DOI, and it's another way that their research can be found and used. And also, so this statistic was mentioned in the Elsevier presentation yesterday as well. So it's a really interesting study that was published in PLOS One, which shows a link between open data sharing and increased citation potential of the research. So there's a clear kind of delineation between sharing the open data and people trusting it, citing it. And then if you're interested, there's a great article by Florian Markowitz about 5 selfish ways to share open data, which I'd encourage you to look at. And it includes things like, for the researcher's own perspective, they can actually, by sharing their data openly, later on, when they want to come back to use that data, it's somewhere easily accessible. They don't have to dig in their own files and find it in a way that they can make sense of it. That work's already been done. And for this slide, there's been a lot of talk at the conference about the challenges in adopting open research, which are very real and really useful to hear from a regional perspective. And we thought it worth sharing some of our experience as a publisher of perhaps misconceptions around open data when it comes to researchers sharing their data. So the first that we hear quite a lot is, I don't have any data, this isn't relevant to me. And I know that that can be true because when you think of a data or a data set, you're automatically thinking of a big spreadsheet, big data, lots of numbers. Whereas that is true, that is data, but it's not just numerical, it's also visual, audiovisual, geospatial, lots of different types of data can be relevant in these policies. One of the ways that we find is quite helpful for researchers in humanities and social sciences, for example, is to think of it as open materials, just sharing the references and the work that they've undertaken to get to that point. The other one that we hear is data sharing isn't a thing in my field, which absolutely will be true in some cases. We know that there's huge variance when it comes to different disciplines. In STEM, it's much easier and much more practical to share research when that's not necessarily the case in some humanities, some social sciences fields. And what we would say to that is that, yes, that may be the case, but the benefits remain the same. And so we would encourage you where you can to share that data. this is a really big one and that we've already heard referenced in this conference, is that researchers really fear that they're going to be scooped if they share their data. So if they put their data out there first, somebody else might use it, publish it, claim it as their own. But actually, open data sharing can mitigate against that by publishing your data in depositing your data in a repository. It will have a DOI, it will have a timestamp, and it will be linked to you as a researcher. So it's a really great way for you to kind of claim ownership in your own research, which is hard to do if it's on your own kind of individual drive or it's somewhere only you can access or a number of people can access. And then the fourth one, data sharing is too hard. And I appreciate by the time a researcher has come to publish, they've already had to get over a load of hurdles to get to the point of sharing their research. And asking them to share their data openly can feel like the last thing that they want to do. So the next slide I'm going to go through is really our attempt to show that it doesn't have to be and that publishers want to help researchers do that. So F1000, our data policy, is demonstrated in this infographic. And I mentioned earlier that we endorse the FAIR data principles. So that is that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this breaks down into the various images that we have here. So firstly, to make the data set findable, we encourage authors to deposit their data set in a repository. And we have guidance on what kind of repositories we'd recommend, make sure it's a trusted source, that it can have a persistent identifier, so like a DOI, so they can link to that. And we don't host the data as a publisher. So it's very much down to the author to select the repository that works for them. And then the accessible bit of FAIR will be enabled by open licensing of the data. And we have lots of guidance on this. And what we recommend for researchers is to use the CC0 and CC BY licenses. So that's like all the content that we publish as well. Everything we publish is open access with CC BY licenses, and the data, we recommend that too. So others can use it and access it. And the discoverability of data too is enabled by the recommendations that researchers cite their data in their references, and also that they have a data availability statement, which really clearly shows where the data is hosted, and if they have to manage access, how that process is being managed. And then the interoperable bit, that is kind of making sure that data can speak to other data sets. That's enabled by using open file formats. And again, we have recommendations and guidance around that. And all of this taken together makes sure that the data is replicable and reusable, and therefore can enable greater knowledge sharing. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour on open data. And the next section we've already spoken about a bit more. But as Carolyn said, it's often easy to go down the route when we think about open research, to think about the research article, to think about open access. And that very much is true for us too, but we want to really broaden out the way that people think about a research article. And so the various types of research peer-reviewed articles that people can publish with us, we have quite an array, and this is not the entirety. And the way that they're designed is to enable publication across the research lifecycle, but also to enable publication from authors at different stages of their career. So it could be an early career researcher, or it could be a PI. To enable publication from different research roles, it might be a methodologist has been involved very carefully in a research study, but actually when it comes to publishing a research article, they're just one name of 30 on the list of authors. Whereas with this workflow, they could publish a method article and get credit and visibility for that piece of work that they've done. But also, it really is about enabling earlier sharing. And I think that came across yesterday in the presentations, that importance of early sharing of research. So it means that researchers don't have to wait right to the end of their research process when they can publish that research article, which is that narrative overview. They can share really early stages of their research. They can pre-register it via a registered report or a study protocol, or they can share it at the point of the data analysis, the methodology, etc. And just an example of kind of how this works in practice. So one of the partners that we have, the Wellcome Trust, they have their own platform, Wellcome Open Research. This is a place where all of the funded recipients of Wellcome funding can publish. And this operates on a diamond open access model. So Wellcome are actually covering all the costs of APCs. And this has been launched since 2016. And since that point, we found a really good uptake of different types of research articles. So as Carolyn said, this quite accurately maps onto F1000 research as well. But 51% of the published content is research articles, and the rest are those novel research types that we've highlighted on the last slide. Study protocols, method articles, and open letters being particularly popular. And then very quickly, not to dwell too much on this, but we also enable publication of non-peer-reviewed research outputs as well. So things like grey literature, conference posters, conference slides, things that are really integral parts of the research process, but often are not very discoverable. Researchers don't get credit for it. We enable a publication route for that. So it's not peer-reviewed, but it will have a DOI, it will have a CC BY license, and it will have commenting functionality that people can engage with that piece of work. And this is all about recognizing the more holistic view of research outputs, which is very much in line with things like the Declaration on Research Assessment. So finally, the last section of my part of the presentation is on the open peer review process that we adopt. And we know that this is a part that can be very different for researchers. They may not have experienced this type of peer review process before, so it's worth taking the time to go through. And as I said, there's many different flavors of open peer review. It can be a bit of a catch-all term, and it's not necessarily clear what that means. So I'll go through exactly what we mean by open peer review at F1000. So firstly, it's open identities. So the peer reviewers, when they accept the invitation to review, they agree to have their name and their affiliation attributed to their report. And that's published on the website alongside the article. So you can see exactly who the reviewer is, and the reviewer and the author know who each other is as well. The reports themselves too are open access and published alongside the content. And I'll show you an example of how that works. But this is all about enabling trust and integrity as part of the review process. So someone coming to a piece of research can kind of look at who the expert reviewer is and what they've said and what their view is of that piece of research. And also they're asked to assign a status. So many of you will be familiar with the accept, reject, major, minor revisions language used in traditional journals. This is slightly different, and they're asked to assign one of these three. But again, it's all about being very clear and making sure they're accountable for the decision that they've made. And what all of these taken together enable is trust and its integrity in the process. But for the peer reviewer, this is a whole level of visibility that they haven't had necessarily before. So when a double-blind peer review process happens, a lot of the same work happens, but behind closed doors. But what this does is really put it front and center, and reviewers can get credit for all of that work that goes on behind the scenes. They can assign their ORCID IDs to reports, and the reports themselves have DOIs. Their actual review report could be cited, downloaded, viewed. So this just shows you exactly kind of how that appears. So this is an example of an article on F1000 research. And you can see the main article, the abstract, all of the article level metrics. And then at the side of this is the open peer review panel. So that's the first thing that people will see. And they can see already how many versions of an article has been published. So in this case, the author has published 3, 2 in response to peer reviewer comments. And you can see who's reviewed it as well. And when you click on the icons of the approved, the reservations, that will take you through to the peer review reports. And you can also see clearly how the author has amended their article. So this is a whole level of transparency that you wouldn't necessarily get with a double-blind peer review. And this is a snapshot of the reports themselves. So again, you can see the reviewers' names, you can see the status, you can browse through all their comments and the author's responses as well. But really excitingly, you can cite the report again. And this enables really great practices like co-reviewing, where we know that this happens in certain subject areas where an early career researcher is helping a more senior academic in reviewing something. And again, they wouldn't get credit for that work, but here enables a route for them to have that. So that brings us to the end of the presentation of Taylor and Francis and F1000. And at this point, we're really interested to hear from you as to kind of what you think and what you think are the main challenges and opportunities for open research when it comes to this region. And so what we're going to attempt to do is use the interactive polling software menti.com, which many of you might have used before, and hopefully people online can engage with as well. So what we'd encourage you to do is, if you have a phone or a tablet or a laptop, is go to menti.com. And then when you get to there, you will be asked to put in a code. And you can either do that or try and scan the QR code, which hopefully will work from a distance. And what this will do is take you to the first of 3 polls where we were really interested to hear from you. And at this point, hopefully everyone's been able to get the code and the QR code. I'm hoping we'll be able to flip to the other screen to show the first poll. Oh, great. So the question is, the first question, what drives you or your researchers to publish open access or in an open research workflow? And so already we're seeing answers come in, and this will change, as you see. So funding, yep, funding policies are hugely influential. Sustainability is really interesting to see. Visibility, that's really the major one that we've seen. Fast, free access, interesting. And higher discoverability, absolutely. That's things that we see across the board. And no barriers to access, I think that's a really important one. So I'll just pause while that continues to evolve, hopefully. And these will also be available after the conference. So we're going to share the results on social media as well. So if you're interested, we can do that. Yep, dissemination of science, global readership, opportunity to be cited. Yep, and you'll notice the change of size. So obviously visibility and opportunity to be cited are things that are coming up a lot. Great, okay, so what I might do is go to the next question, but we can always kind of come back to this at the end. So the next one, and we've heard a lot about this, especially in this morning sessions, and it's really interesting for us to hear that regional difference that happens. But we also want to hear from you in terms of what you perceive as the challenges, particularly in MENA, in adopting open research practices. And we have a sense of what that might be, but these are all our own lack of awareness. Yeah, fear of plagiarism, that's really interesting. And the lack of awareness, I think, is something for us to take on and think about how we can further engage in the region as a publisher, but there's lots of, it has to be a collaborative effort. Policy missing, absolutely. I mean, there's no secret that lots of these open access policies came from Europe and Northern and Western Europe at that. And that's where we've seen a lot of organizations and mandates. So the two follow on. Lack of incentives, definitely. Institutional resistance. Oh, I'd be interested to understand that one a little bit more. And worries about credibility. Absolutely. And that links into incentives. I think if people are incentivized to publish in certain locations, and it's not necessarily about how they share their research, that will feed into it. Security and copyright, interesting. And on the licensing front, at F1000, all of our licenses CC BY, so it's about as open and reusable as it can be. But we know that there are different requirements around licenses for different types of research. Okay. So I might actually go to the final question, and then at the end we can come back through them, see if there's anything new. So this is one we'd like to kind of close this bit of the session with, and then hopefully lead us into the Q&A section, which is, what would you like to see from publishers when it comes to open research? And we're particularly interested in this and your answers to this. And appreciate you might need some time to think, in which case we can also take Q&A. More tools, interesting. No APCs. Yes, APCs as a business model we know can can be a particular barrier to certain regions. Free APCs. So I'm guessing these two together, free APCs, yeah. So again, this is sort of thinking about business models, and article processing charges very much were embedded in the start of the open access movement as a way to shift from paying to read to paying to publish. And they've been very much embedded in the business model of open access, for better or for worse. But I think it's definitely something to think about from a publisher perspective. More educational resource, definitely. And hopefully, I mean, as a publisher, that's something we'd want to help with, but would have to work closely with institutions and funders. Removing the paywall, so that would be to publish, I guess. So a lot about pricing and business models, which definitely we can discuss more. Oh, sessions like this. Oh, well, thank you, whoever put that. Very happy to do more sessions like this. Okay, so maybe if we can leave it on screen and we can open for questions if there are any now, either in the room or online.
Okay, two quick questions. You mentioned rapid and open. Is it equal to preprint?
Sorry, could you just repeat the first bit of that? I think I just lost the sound.
You mentioned rapid and open.
Mm-hmm.
Is it equal to preprint?
Interesting, yeah. So the rapid and open is equal to preprint. So in terms of F1000, it's a bit like a preprint, that part of the module, if you separate it out, in that it's early sharing of research, it's getting research out there before it's been peer reviewed, and it's a rapid way to share your research findings, which, as we all know, we saw a huge rise of in COVID, and the need to share that early parts of your research. The way that we differ from a preprint server is that we have the initial stringent editorial checks before we publish. So we'll check for plagiarism, we'll check for ethics, we'll check the legibility, and we'll check the data as well before that's published. And it's only when it's passed all those pre-publication checks that we will then publish it. So we've got some extra checks at the beginning because we only want to publish sound research. And then, of course, the open peer review bit happens. So it's a kind of one-stop shop for a preprint plus the quality assurance of peer review plus editorial checks. So it is like a preprint, and it's the early sharing, but it's kind of preprint plus enhanced, if you see what I mean.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hear me?
I don't think the mic is working, but I can hear, so I'll repeat.
I don't think this, where is it? I've got a question about data. So you said that, you know, like you could publish data and it will improve credibility, people can check it. I was wondering, because of the open licensing, the CC0 and CC BY, in your opinion, what could be further applications of that? Like, rather than just viewing it and checking, what would be let's say an application?
That's a really good question. So I'll repeat in case of the heard, and kind of what's the next step from sharing open data with an open license. Is there kind of more we can do, sort of, if I'm surmising that? I mean, I can give my 2 pence on that, and then Carolyn might want to add. But yeah, I think definitely, I think that the issue is sort of resource and the cost of doing extra things. I think there's been an interest in, we talk about replicability and reproducibility. And we know that there's been interest or certain areas where people have appointed a replicability editor, for example. So it's not just enough to share your data open. They want to have someone who tries to replicate it, who tries to rerun it. And that's very much the case with open code sharing practices. We embed things like Code Ocean, where people can kind of deposit their code embedded in the article, and people can then try and rerun it. And that's one thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's then replicable. So there's an added step there, I think, that would be really interesting to explore. But obviously that's kind of more resource, more time, more technology probably needed. But I think there's something there that's quite interesting. Anything you want to add, Carolyn?
I don't know if this is necessarily taking it a step further, but I think in terms of how we can apply use cases, something that I think is, we all know, I think is growing enormously is interdisciplinary research. And I think having open data sets or open materials can really benefit that as well, because you can get a data set or a set of resources collected as part of one research project for a specific use. But actually then when it's made available, we've seen examples of where research teams in a completely different field have found that really valuable to be able to apply to their research. So I think thinking about it in a more cross-disciplinary way, and actually in that sense, reducing the need for resources and cost within research, because it's already been done, it's already been collected, it's already there. I think is a really, that's something that I think we've found quite interesting to see is that kind of interdisciplinary use. Yeah. I think there's one coming.
Hello, yeah, thank you for this interesting, beneficial presentation. Just with a question about Arabic language research that is written in pure Arabic. Does that like support the same like offers and the preprint? Does it support the Arabic language research? Do they have the same share of care and offers?
On F1000 research specifically, not yet. So we've just started last year or the year before for the first time. We've launched a venue where we can publish in Japanese. So that's the first time we've done anything outside of English on this platform. But we're definitely looking at other languages that we would be able to publish in, and Arabic is
It's also taken into account.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's actually, I think, the one that we get asked for most. So would probably be top of the list, to be honest.
Sure, yeah. We would like to be informed once this service is available. So if we can keep in touch.
Yeah, definitely.
That would be great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
In this session, like yesterday and today, there have been many non-profit platform is being introduced. So how can say some uniqueness of this is, we have to pay for this platform. So what is the uniqueness you can claim compared to non-profit platform like this?
What is the uniqueness of this compared to non-profits? Is that the question? Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah, okay. Yeah, so I think one of the slides that I showed earlier really highlighted that we're aware that this isn't as unique as it was when it was first launched. I think there's a lot of platforms doing elements of this. So there's a lot of experimentation with open peer review. As Becky said, there's all different kind of ways of doing this. We've all seen the rise of preprint servers, particularly in certain fields. To our knowledge, there's no other publishing platform that brings it all together exactly as this one does. But I think actually the way that we see it is it's a good thing that more of these are available. I don't think it's not something where we don't want there to be competition. We want there to be more options for this, because that leads to the sort of transformative growth in open research practices that is our mission. So I think actually by having a whole range of places that researchers can adopt open research practices and different types of platforms, it just embeds it as more of a kind of normal part of research rather than being an exception to the rule, which we see as a good thing.
I just remembered my second question. Okay, in the open review model, and if the manuscript is approved, does this mean it's equal to accepted in the traditional model, and is it peer reviewed?
So that is a very good question, which I'll repeat in case anyone didn't hear, but it is in the open peer review module. In fact, I might just I'll leave it so we can see. In the open peer review model, when someone's given an accepted status, is that equal to in another journal when it's been kind of peer reviewed and published? Is that the question? Yes, essentially, it is the easy answer. So because we operate quite differently, we publish and then peer review, the way that we index our research is also quite different. And so basically the way we work with indexers is that they will only index research published on our platforms that have received 2 accepted statuses. So that's the point where it has technically passed peer review. So at that point, it will then be kind of zipped off to the indexers that we work with. And before that point, it's very much an evolving article. And we make it very clear in the title of the article itself at what point that is, whether it's had new peer review reports, and if it has, what were the statuses applied. So yeah, essentially, in fact, I'm going to slightly amend my answer. 2 accept statuses is equivalent to an article that's been published after double-blind peer review. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thank you. I think we're done. So thank you, everyone. And we can share these as well if anyone's interested.